Today on the International Risk Podcast, we're looking at one of the most dangerous and consequential areas of the world, and that's the Taiwan Strait. And joining me to discuss this is Ava Shen from the Eurasia Group, who covers Taiwan, Chinese foreign policy, and domestic politics. So today we're asking, where is Taiwan heading and what should the rest of us be paying attention to? Ava, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thank you, Dominic, for inviting me onto the show.
So, whereabouts in the world do we find you today and what's keeping you busy?
I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I work for the Eurasia Group, which is in political risk consultancy. So every day I advise different types of clients around the world about different political risks, specifically related to China and Taiwan, that people should be paying attention to.
Excellent. Well, look, I know the Eurasia Group well. I know you guys produce some excellent analysis. So, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And jumping straight into it, I mean, Beijing's pressure on Taiwan, it now seems much less like a dramatic invasion scenario, notwithstanding even just last week, there was one of the largest exercises we've seen in a really long time. But notwithstanding that, it seems that there might be a strategy more of constant pressure, well below the threshold of war, still has military exercises, still has maritime pressure, there's still air incursions, but it's more disinformation and political intimidation. But in your view, what does this grey zone campaign actually aim to achieve? And what do you expect us to be seeing over the next 1 to 2 years?
Yeah, so I think Beijing's ultimate aim toward Taiwan is that it would like to achieve some sort of political unification where it can say that mainland China and Taiwan truly belong to one China. So Beijing's official stance is called the One China Principle, which means that both mainland China and Taiwan are governed under the People's Republic of China. But in reality, Taiwan enjoys a tremendous amount of autonomy, and a lot of people within Taiwan see mainland China and Taiwan as two separate entities. And so for Beijing, Taiwan is ultimately a political problem. It can be solved by military means, but China prefers to not solve the Taiwan issue with an outright invasion because there are a lot of different risks that are involved. Not to at least say that the US may get involved in some way, and the US is the largest security provider for Taiwan, even though the two don't have an explicit military alliance.
Thanks very much for explaining that, Eva. And I think a lot of outside observers still treat Taiwan through this binary lens of either independent or unified with mainland China. But I think that misses the point of domestic politics within Taiwan, which of course exists just like in every other country. And so I would love to hear from you about how much of the domestic political debate within Taiwan is actually about China versus about the cost of living, wages, housing costs, and the sort of frustrations that every domestic audience has about their situation.
Yeah, I'm so happy you asked that question because I think a lot of English reporting of Taiwan is often occurring in the context of the Chinese threat. And Taiwan itself is a democracy and has a lot of diverse voices within its political landscape. That is not to say that China does not matter as a policy issue. Traditionally, in presidential elections, that is when China as an issue becomes more salient. So, because for the average Taiwanese, China falls into the bucket of both national security and foreign policy for some people. And so this topic is much more salient during presidential elections. And during local elections, which happens every 4 years in November, these times are when the sort of cost of living issues and family sort of welfare issues come up more often because those elections are trying to elect mayors, heads of counties and villages, etc. And I also want to say that in presidential elections, obviously the domestic economic issues also matter, but China issues usually take a more salient stage in those elections.
I mean, one of the common things I speak with my analysts about is bias, and we all have them. How we choose our information, how we analyze our information. how we present that analysis to our clients is all informative. And there's confirmation bias, there's anchoring bias, there's availability bias, overconfidence bias, even self-serving biases. And I think one of the biases when it comes to Taiwan is this mirror imaging, where we assume that Beijing sees time, sees pressure, sees political signaling in the same way that we do in Washington, in Taipei, Brussels, London, or Stockholm. So, as someone who's had a real international career and got this fantastic ability to use different lenses, and as someone who works on analyzing Taiwan and Chinese politics professionally, what do you think most Western analysts are still misunderstanding when they look at Beijing and they try to determine Beijing's intentions and actions towards Taiwan?
I think there's still a very common fear that Beijing is going to definitely invade Taiwan. And I think that is not true. It's not to say that Beijing doesn't want to unify with Taiwan. It definitely wants to. But the method of which Beijing wants to achieve that is actually less outright violent. And also, as we have seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war that is still happening in Europe, I think this is a lesson for China, for the Chinese leadership, that war can often be unpredictable and you often end up suffering a more tremendous loss than you would first have foreseen. So I think this option is very costly for Beijing and has a lot of unknown risks. So instead, I think we should have a more realistic picture of Beijing's strategy, which is more of a uh, winning without fighting. So Beijing would like to keep all of its pressure campaigns below the threshold of outright conflict. It makes it more difficult for the U.S. to intervene and for other of Taiwan's partners to raise awareness. But then at the same time, it is making things more difficult for Taiwan.
I mean, I still wonder though, and I hope you're right. I really do, Ava. But one of the things that I saw in Iraq in the early 2000s was, even though many Iraqis wanted Saddam Hussein gone, they didn't want to be bombed by Americans and they didn't want to be occupied by Americans. And very quickly they became anti American. We see the same in Iran today. Many Iranians want to see a new government in place and wanted to see a new style, a new form of government. But those same Iranians today are very anti American. They're anti against getting their own civilian infrastructure, hospitals, energy infrastructure, roads, schools, children being killed by these bombs. And so, with that said, noting the fact that reunification is one thing, but no one wants to be attacked, and noting that China's recent actions towards Taiwan has focused on these large scale military deals, missile firings, and we saw late 2025 there was a Justice Mission 2025, which was 2 days of war games that involved the army, the air force, the navy. There was rocket fire around Taiwan. And it was described as a serious warning against independence, and they practiced blockade style tactics. And of course, there's been repeated, as I said, just this week, where there's been over 100 aircraft being flying within a close space of Taiwan, including Navy, all within about 24 hours of each other. And so these encirclement drills and what's often referred to as this anaconda strategy, if China's intent isn't to invade, what are they hoping to achieve with this action? Noting that no one's going to see it favorably other than perhaps Chinese citizens. What is the goal with the military and the physical posturing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think the objectives behind Beijing's military exercises is one of deterrence, which is very counterintuitive by a sort of foreign audience standards. So in English language media, we often see these exercises being reported as aggressive behavior, as Beijing asserting its military authority, and I completely understand why people see it that way. And but from Beijing's perspective, is actually one of deterrence. So, from their point of view, President William Lai, compared to previous Taiwanese presidents, has been much more outspoken about the legal basis of Taiwanese sovereignty. So, as I said earlier, Beijing sees Taiwan as a political question. So Beijing actually takes a tremendous weight on what President Lai says day in, day out. And so there are some important speeches that President Lai has made, such as his inauguration speech back in 2024. And also, there has been a speech last year in March where President Lai defined China as a foreign hostile force. I don't want to say Beijing is misunderstood by the world because perception from different sides matter, and this is something that Beijing needs to take into account as well, especially in the context of its rising military spending and expanding military force. It is understandable that the rest of the world sees this as aggressive behavior, but in Beijing's mind, it's doing this as a responsible actor deploying military exercises to tamp down the tensions across the Taiwan Strait.
Interesting. So it's not actually an aggressive act, it's more one that they're attempting to do in order to de-escalate and avoid further escalation.
Yeah, that is the intention behind Beijing's actions.
So for with that said, so I wonder for business leaders, for investors, for policymakers who are based in North America, who are based in Europe, what are the early warning indicators that they should be watching? What are the things in the headlines, the signals that Taiwan's risk is actually declining? What should they be looking out for?
And so, what are the actual sort of risks that people should worry about down the line if invasion is a very much a tail risk scenario? Quarantine can lead to business risks for clients around the world. So, a quarantine is when China deploys maritime law enforcement vessels. So, think Coast Guard or other types of small boats around Taiwan to try to disrupt shipping across the Taiwan Strait.
And the obvious question, and of course, you being a political analyst, you'll hate this question, but what do you think the likelihood of that is of a quarantine?
So I think it is relatively unlikely in the next 2 years because, again, we also have to take into account China's domestic calculations. So the Chinese leadership doesn't have only the Taiwan question to worry about. In fact, it has a host of other problems that it has to worry about in the domestic economy in China. So there are lots of different factors within Taiwan and also with the U.S. As well. But if there's anything that Beijing interprets as, um, either Taiwan or the U.S. asserting Taiwanese independence in any way, then I think Beijing would consider a quarantine as an option for retaliation in the next 2 to 3 years.
Now, Eva, if we look domestically, Taiwan is often celebrated due to its position as a liberal democracy. However, political divisions on the island are not necessarily separated by this economic left right divide that we often see in many countries, but instead by how political actors deal with this cross strait tension. And elections are generally dominated by the two parties, the DPP and the KMT. Can you explain the main political differences, especially regard to the China question, and what matters to the foreign audiences?
Yeah, sure. So the incumbent DPP, their position on China is that Taiwan is an independent sovereign country, and that it has been separate from China in terms of legal and sovereign authority. And in order for Taiwan and China to have a peaceful, productive relationship, China needs to realize that Taiwan is separate from the greater China identity. Beijing needs to respect Taipei's authority as well. So this is a position that's obviously very much at odds with Beijing's position, and that is one of the reasons why the official dialogue between Taipei and Beijing has been frozen since 2016. Taiwan should be respected as its own entity. Its leaning is not as explicit as the DPP in terms of Taiwanese independence, but it is also emphasizing that Taiwan is autonomous and China should respect that. So that's kind of the broader landscape of domestic Taiwanese politics in regards to a different party's China policy.
And what are the domestic issues? We know in America, for example, it's the cost of living and immigration. We know that in Taiwan, there's been significant disputes between the DPP and the KMT over budgets, parliamentary reforms, local government spending. Of course, pensions has been another issue. Stagflation and stagnating wages is a big concern. What are the domestic topics that really matter to the average person in Taiwan?
One of the most salient issues right now is the central government budget. So usually the central government budget of 1 year should have been passed by the end of the preceding year. So in this year, we are in this unprecedented situation in which we are in the year 2026, but the central government budget for 2026 has not been passed. Taiwan's government will just run on the budget allocated for 2025, which means that there can be no budget increases from the preceding year. So the DPP is very much a proponent of increasing national defense spending. So President Lai has laid out this annual target for 2026 to increase defense spending to more than 3% of GDP. And he has also additionally proposed a special defense budget as outside from the central government budget to allocate in total around 40 billion US dollars across the next 7 years to buy US weapons and to build up a multi-layered defense system for Taiwan that's called the T-Dome. And so the controversy here for the opposition parties is that we are spending too much on defense, and how are we going to balance the defense spending with national welfare spending? And this debate has been sort of festering within the Taiwanese political um, debate for several months, at least since last November when Lai first unveiled his special defense budget. And the criticism from the KMT and the TPP is that Lai is trying to meet US demands over considerations of his own domestic populace. And in return, the argument that Lai and other DPP politicians have been saying is that if we don't increase our defense, we cannot meet the China military threat well, and we cannot convince the US that Taiwan has a commitment to defend itself. So this is kind of the ongoing major debate in Taiwanese politics right now.
I mean, there's credible reports of Chinese disinformation campaigns really permeating Taiwanese politics. And I've certainly seen that Beijing is applying military, cyber, economic, and influence operations to try and undermine Taiwan without using direct force, but with that goal of eroding confidence and eroding unity within Taiwan. And certainly we see, very heated clashes between the political parties in Taiwan. To what extent do you think Beijing is actually playing a role in influencing Taiwanese politics today?
I think there is a contradiction in Chinese political interference in Taiwanese politics because it often works against Beijing's favor. So one of the earliest instances that I can think of is in 1996 when Taiwan is having its first direct presidential election where the people of Taiwan actually gets to vote for who they want their president to be. And so in response to that, China decided to hold military exercises around Taiwan and firing missiles into the water. And the outcome of that intimidation is that the Taiwanese people elected Li Denghui by popular vote. And even though Li is from the KMT party, he is someone who believed in Taiwan's own sovereignty, and he advocated for, Taiwan's place on the international stage. And another example, which brings me to 2019, 2020, the 2020 presidential election in Taiwan was won by the DPP. President Tsai Ing-wen won her second term, and part of her victory should be credited to what Beijing did actually. So Beijing decided to do a political crackdown in Hong Kong, basically ending the one country, two system model as we knew before by basically integrating Hong Kong further into the Chinese political system. And the crackdown of these protests in Hong Kong really had an effect on Taiwanese voters, and basically it uh, skyrocketed President Tsai's uh, supporting rate, and that allowed her to win her second term. So when Beijing decides to do some sort of interference to try to intimidate the Taiwanese voters into voting a certain way, the effect is usually the opposite. So this type of interference often doesn't work. And there is another type of interference which you have talked about earlier, which is a cyber campaign tried to inject disinformation into the Taiwan internet sphere. And there's also a lot of people who use, Chinese apps in Taiwan, such as Xiaohongshu and TikTok. So these applications, people often see content coming from China, and some of those content, are sort of intentionally directed to Taiwanese users, and some are just sort of, um, other, algorithm just discoveries. But this type, I think it's more difficult to quantify what exact sort of election outcomes they have led to. But the effect that they're having is that it is, polarizing Taiwanese society, and uh, it is a threat to Taiwanese democracy. And so what has Taiwan done in response to this? I think Taiwan has a lot of different scholars and different nonprofit organizations that are dedicated to researching disinformation coming from China, and also hosting workshops for people and companies on how to counter such disinformation and how to recognize disinformation so that you don't forward things to your friends to cause broader panic.
Interesting. And so looking forward for the next couple of years, what's your prediction? Do you expect much of the same, or do you expect to see any notable changes in the region?
So I think there definitely will be periods of high tension around certain high profile political events. So the next watch point we have on the calendar is the October 10th speech by President William Lai. So in this speech, he usually talks about other domestic policy agendas, but also he will touch upon cross-strait relations and how he feels about his approach to China. So Beijing will be watching this speech closely and will be judging what he is saying about cross-strait relations to previous speeches that he has done. So if he says something that's, even more forward-leaning on Taiwanese independence on what he has said before, then it is likely that Beijing will respond with some kind of military exercise. And going forward in 2027, it's obviously a very momentous year for the Chinese military, since it's the 100th anniversary. So um, I think China will probably conduct some kind of military exercise to demonstrate its strength, or some kind of parade. And that is also the year when the 21st Party Congress will occur. And so China will also be on vigilance to, you know, be more sensitive to any type of perceived provocations that come from Taiwan or the US. And as we move on to 2028, we have two important elections. So there is the Taiwanese presidential election and legislative election. There is also the US election happening in the same year. So there will be two leadership transitions in the of the three important players in this complicated Taiwan Strait relationship. So there will be a lot of changes there as well. I don't think there will be, a high chance of war at all. But there will be periods of tension as we you know, move closer to these important events.
Certainly a lot to be putting on our calendar there, Ava. And when you look around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
On top of mind is probably the ongoing war in the Middle East between the US and Iran, and also with Israel's involvement. I think this war is a perfect illustration of how interconnected the world is. And also at the same time, how vulnerable the world is to a single point of disruption with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I think we are going to see the impact of this war be much more long lasting than how long the war will be. And I think in terms of how the impact will be just distributed, I think is going to be unequal to to different regions of the world. I think in Asia, a lot of countries are very much dependent on energy imports from the Middle East, and we've already seen them, coming under pressure of high energy prices. And in the case of Taiwan, it is a test for their energy resilience and also has potential lessons for what if they come under the same kind of energy shortage, but this time caused by a Chinese quarantine of some kind. And so Taiwan is trying to reassess its energy positions in terms of its energy reserves. Taiwan has only around 14 days of LNG reserves, and it has around 120 days of oil reserves. And recently, we have President Lai saying that he is willing to consider restarting nuclear energy in Taiwan, which is a big deal. So, as of 2025, all of the nuclear power plants in Taiwan have closed because there is a lot of opposition to nuclear energy adoption in Taiwan, especially within the DPP camp, because it is very much tied to the democratization movement in Taiwan starting from the 1980s, and also they're very worried about safety issues as a lot of earthquakes occur in Taiwan. But because of this sort of energy vulnerability that's been caused by the Iran war, um, the current DPP administration is willing to change its stance because Taiwan needs stable electricity and power supply to develop for Taiwanese, but also to develop its semiconductor industry and to develop its AI industry as well.
Well, thanks for explaining that, Ava. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dominic.
Well, that was a great conversation with Ava Shen from the Eurasia Group. I really appreciated hearing her thoughts on the nature of Taiwanese domestic politics, as well as China's influence, and of course, the risks shaping tensions across the strait. Today's episode was produced and coordinated by Keir Fairley. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.